Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday, March the 21st edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting at MakerDAO. Today's meeting is going to be following a common theme that we've discussed in our last call. Actually, Stephen, were you going to get into that? Should I talk about themes, or did you want to pick that up?
I'll just pick that up if you don't mind.
I would not mind at all. So I'll do the preamble then. Hooray. If people that haven't heard this 27 times already, if you're a long-time listener, we're very interested in facilitating a conversation. That is the point of these calls. We need information from the community. We have a lot of very, very smart people on this call with deep insight into the space. We need to know what they're thinking. So if you have a question, if you have a comment and an observation, please type that into the chat at the side. And if you don't have a microphone, somebody will find that, and we'll do our best to read these questions out. If we don't get an opportunity to read those questions out, what we've been doing is copying the unanswered questions and then adding them to the post-meeting discussion thread in Reddit. And hopefully we'll be able to pick those things up during the course of the week before our next call. That post-discussion thread in Reddit is a new addition to the proceedings, and what we've been doing is the conclusion is that there's far too much going on in these calls. This isn't really the place to make firm decisions or achieve consensus. This is the place to observe data, have a discussion, set the context and the tone of what we're up to, and then we will aggregate that data, put the recordings and the transcripts and all the rest into Reddit, and then we'll continue that debate in a text form and hopefully a civilized and restrained manner for the next week or so, and that will lead us to a long-term decision-making process, but it also creates a historical record so we can see exactly what was talked about and when and all the rest. So those are for the typed in questions. If you have access to a microphone, feel free to jump in at any time if you have a question, comment, or a complaint, and we will address it. Back to the theme of tightening up the agenda, I'm going to hand it off to Stephen immediately, and then Stephen's going to talk to us about some interesting things in his world and governance in general. Then I'm going to pick it up, and I'll have a brief chat about the state of governance that got us up to this point. So what happened in the vote last week of the poll, what that positions us, how that positions us today, and what the next steps are. And after that, we'll talk to Cyrus will tell us about the numbers. So Cyrus from Risk will give us a presentation. After that, we'll jump into a Q&A. All right, off to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Firstly, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The one thing I'd like to do is to extend the point that Richard was making. I would like to basically take this opportunity to consider and remind ourselves of two important points. The first is the structure of these calls, and the second is the reason for these calls. It is extraordinarily important. We need to consider this because, excuse me a sec, it really boils down to participation and the sense of what the participation looks like. So to the structure of these calls. Now, the structure of these calls will be based around one or a collection of, the following themes. The first theme is, effectively the state of demand and supply in the system. The second theme is with respect to collateral types, collateral portfolio, and the related risk parameters attributed to them and the portfolio as a whole. And then the third theme is with respect to exogenous risk, or risk that is outside of the system that we still need to consider. For example, risks posed by the Ethereum protocol, as an example. These themes are, I would say, broad enough to capture the full ambit of what we need to consider in these calls. So for today's calls, we will sort of unsurprisingly focus on the state of demand and supply. But please keep in mind that the main theme of the call can change and is dependent on what MKR governance would like to tackle. So the folks facilitating this call are here to sort of kick the process off and get the conversation momentum going around governance, but at the same time be very mindful of what MKR holders look to talk about and want to get into. So that being said, I would also like to remind everyone as to the purpose of this call. This call is a place that helps facilitate and only facilitate a part of the whole governance process. And this process, this whole governance process, is the sole responsibility of MKR token holders, collectively known as governance. And it is really up to this decentralized governance to decide the direction of the system. Please keep this in mind, because it is really important to understand that the onus of responsibility is on you as the stakeholder in the system, and it is very much on you as the MKR token holder. And we are here to help facilitate this process and to basically try and keep it contagious and flowing, and with a certain amount of momentum, that the salient features and the important points are always in the mind's eye of MKR token holders, or what obviously we like to collectively know as the decentralized governance of the system. So that's my little intro for today. As I said, the theme for today will be again on demand and supply. That's where we kick off. But obviously, as Q&As come in, we can figure out how we can tackle other challenges as well. So given that, I'm going to pass back to Rich.
All right, thanks, Stephen. It's good to set that context. And actually, I'm a huge fan of context myself, so I'm gonna do some of my own. Let's talk about how voting has worked in the system over the last 7 days. We've seen some interesting things. After the call last Thursday, we brought the discussion into Reddit. We just had a very spirited chat. It was great. The level of discourse in our subreddit is constantly a source of amazement to me. I'm not sure if everybody here are active Redditors or not, but frankly, Reddit is a cesspool, especially when it comes to crypto. But the MakerDAO subreddits are shining exceptions to that rule, which I'm not entirely sure how that happened or why, but I'm going to do everything I can to keep it that way. So the debate was excellent, very insightful. It's led to a poll being initiated in the system on Monday, and that poll offered 3 different selections for voters to choose from. Leaving the stability fee at 0%, raising the stability fee by 2%, or by 4%. So there's 3 options that could have been chosen. We saw some very interesting engagement with the system this week, which was encouraging, because last week we talked about apathy and engagement, and whether that was sort of a significant risk that needed to be addressed, or whether it was something that was going to improve over time. And I think that we've seen some numbers that imply that it's going to improve over time. That poll had more active voters than the previous executive vote had. So obviously people are getting out to make decisions when they feel that they have skin in the game, which is a great thing to see. So unless things have changed in the voting portal in the last couple minutes, I want to talk about some numbers a bit. We've seen an interesting spread on activity here, and so I ran some very basic, did some very basic spreadsheeting. I'm not going to share it because it's embarrassing to expose to the public. But currently, for the Leave Things As They Are poll, we're seeing 1.5% of the total Maker staked for that option. For the 2% raise, we're at 22.9% in support as far as staked Maker. But the overwhelming lead is for the 4% increase to a total of 7.5. So we've seen 75.6% of the total Maker staked allocated to the third option of raising it by 4%, which is interesting. I would not have predicted that, but that is governance for you in a nutshell. One of the things that I wanted to look at this time was also the distribution of voters as well. So not just obviously, this system is based around skin in the game, but there's interesting metrics to be pulled by figuring out how many people were involved and what the distribution of Maker per voter was. I don't have the distribution numbers ready yet, but as far as voters per option, we're seeing a very interesting alignment. So for the Leave Things As They Are option, 8% of the individual voters selected that one. For the 2% raise, we saw 17% of people voting for that. For the 4% raise, 73%. So there's this interesting alignment with not only the amount of Maker that was staked, but the number of people that chose these options as well, which I hadn't really expected, because when it comes to a skin in the game sort of system, there's always going to be this lingering either resentment, fear, or encouragement that the people with the most to lose are the ones that are most active in these votes. And I think that we've seen a fairly good distribution of people signaling their intentions, regardless of whether they are a whale or not, which I think implies that we have a healthy system developing right now. So that's where we stand right now. What that means is that some point in the next few hours, that vote will time out. I can probably in the next hour and 45 minutes, and then we will have our next step presented to us. And the way things are looking right now is tomorrow at 5 p.m. UTC, we will be putting the winning poll into an executive vote, which will be a 4% increase to 7.5%, unless there's a last minute shift in the landscape, which is obviously always possible. And I think that that's one of the interesting things that I discovered a few minutes before this call, is that there's been a fantastic amount of movement, according to token analyst in Maker in the last 24 hours. So it's entirely possible that we might see some interesting shifts in the next before tomorrow, or we might see that this is just people preparing to reinforce the way that the poll has already moved. But,
quick question, Rich. What
Sure.
percent, if you have this handy, what percent of the market capitalization of Maker is staked for this vote? And is there like a historical line we could look at?
well, I don't know and no, but here's the good news. One of the things that we've been talking about a great deal as well in these calls and also outside of them is that there's a requirement for tooling in the system. We need community-facing tooling. We need some more sophisticated internal tooling. So those numbers will be coming. I did it last week in the MakerGov thread that recapped the events of that executive vote, and I'll make sure that that's included on this one as well, because that would be a good number to capture.
Rich, I got a question. Do you think it's a good idea to schedule the governance poll so that they end, in the few hours leading up to the weekly governance call? Is that something that's...
Yes, Cyrus, I do. It should have, but it didn't, because this is another, in the interest of radical transparency, let's talk about the problems that are involved with governance. From the outside looking in, it's not a big deal. From the inside looking out, oh my God, it's hard. We're auditing the entire system right now, and it's our goal to be able to turn around an entire governance cycle in less than 7 days. So that includes starting off with a call, making it into a debate in Reddit, giving people time to discover what it is that we're talking about, then going into a governance poll, then going into an executive vote, then going into another governance weekly. In order to do that, we've identified, I think there's 37 or 40 individual steps involved with that process, from writing the spells for the blockchain to making sure that the Reddit posts and the Twitter notifications are out there, to having these calls. There's a significant number of stakeholders involved as well. So we're very, very energetically attempting to optimize that process and automate it as much as we possibly can.
Yeah.
But yeah, the next time it'll be over.
I think one thing that would be good to get feedback from the community maybe right now is the length of the governance poll. This week's was only, I believe, 3 or 4 days. I think it went out Monday, whereas I think the previous one was a full 7-day cycle. I'm just interested in, hearing what people think about, the length.
Sure.
Did it feel like it was enough time for people, or? I don't know.
One thing that would be useful when those numbers that I asked about and you said were coming would be useful is to look at, rather than setting like a time limit, looking at a market cap and user limit. So to being like, once we get this amount of quantitative participation, then we're comfortable with the outcome, kind of thing.
Yeah,
that's an interesting way of looking at it. The other thing that we've been thinking about is the commitment drop off. So as over time, sorry, let me collect my thoughts. So if we see that there's less than, X% of Maker staked over the last 6-hour period, then we can assume that people have petered out their level of interest. But it's very, very difficult to create kind of arbitrary ranges on these things, and it might be more useful just to simply publish the fact that, hey, there's a poll, you have 2 days to make your voices heard, and then that's the end of the story.
I also think there's pretty deliberate reasons for not using a quorum, right, Rich? There's all sorts of attack vectors with something like that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's some, we haven't really gotten into the weeds in voting yet, because, well, I don't want to cloud the discussion yet. Well, we're going to get to these things, but there's all kinds of risks involved with these things. And there's collusion, there's vote buying, there's, well, I don't want to list them all, but yeah, there's a lot of reasons why on-chain voting might be fraught with peril. And I think that as these discussions continue, we're going to start to identify those and modify the system as required. But for now, this is what we have, and it seems to be working fairly well. So. But we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the call, and that's why I'm talking so quickly and hoping to move things along. So I want to get to risk and have Cyrus review the current state of the system, and then after that, I want to open up the floor to just any question at all, including governance questions. So Cyrus, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Sure. Let me do a quick screen share. All right, so as most of you are aware, we did not see any significant strengthening in the DAI price this last week. Early on, I think right when the governance poll started, we saw, or right after the governance call last week, we saw slight increase. Things were recovering for a bit, and then as the week carried on, just kind of receded back down. We saw a fairly flat ETH price. We saw fairly flat inventory levels. I'm fairly sure that our inventory levels remained unchanged. Not sure about other market makers. If they want to chime in, they can. We are also in the process of working on some plan to get proof of inventory from various market makers, exploring that process from a technical level. In terms of other statistics, here we can see some CDP stats. We did see significant DAI wipes yesterday, about almost 1.5 million in the past 24 hours. And we did see a slight drop-off in the DAI supply, which is a positive sign, one of the few positive signs we've seen. This is likely, this happened when the result of the governance poll was pretty much determined. It will be interesting to see if that trend continues when the executive poll is run. In terms of tooling, as Rich mentioned, we are working hard behind the scenes to get this process streamlined better, better data visualization, statistical measures. We will be open sourcing data and our models. The eventual goal is to create some sort of risk dashboard that we can all kind of convene on, that compiles all the data that we just keep talking about week after week. It's a work in progress, and it will be coming soon, hopefully. Let's see. That's it for data. In terms of some other minor things, I think for the governance polls, the increments we used last week seem to have been were well received. The 0, 2, and 4 offered a few extra choices for people. The increments of 2% step sizes also seems like it was well received. So I'm hoping that that's the beginning of kind of a template for now. I think that's it for me. Debt ceiling, obviously, there was some concern that we would be hitting it. That never happened, and the DAI supply for now is trending back down.
I have one question for you. Oh, sorry, Lewis, you might actually answer this, so I'll let you go first because it pertains to market makers.
I was actually going to ask a question. So we had the DAI float fall by a few million pretty much in the last 24 hours, but we haven't seen much volume on Bitfinex or Coinbase. It was a question for Cyrus or maybe even Joe or whoever might know the answer. If there was any buying volume on a different market that I'm not seeing.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that volume did not hit any of the screens that I was looking at, so I was curious myself. I don't know if Joe, would you know? Oh, Joe's not on the call right now, so.
I'm here, yes. Sorry, I missed that. What'd you say?
There was like a significant reduction in DAI supply in the last 24 hours, like about 1.5 million. But we don't see any corresponding volume across any of the major exchanges. Do you happen to know anything about that?
No, it's been fluctuating right around here for supply the whole entire way. There hasn't been any major volume, like 5 million, 6 million, like it has in the past. So yeah. I don't think that until we get this thing done, I don't think we'll have that much effect.
I think the other possibility is that somebody went to an OTC desk that had a bunch of inventory, but yeah, that was not us.
My question had to do with, so Cyrus, you mentioned that inventories were flat despite the fact that we drifted back down even slightly below where we were prior to the last stability fee increase. That on its own would be surprising to me, as you'd expect them to be accumulating at that lower price. Though if inventories are flat, that could tell us that they're not accumulating additional inventories potentially because they're saturated. Is that something that you've heard from other market makers? Do you have a sense for why that might be happening?
I think a lot of the inventories are saturated right now.
Yeah.
All the market makers are all complaining that we have way too much DAI. I think the other market makers who are on here want to chirp in and confirm it, but from what I've been talking with everybody agrees.
So that could be potentially worrying if there's no additional support coming and potentially we see another ETH rally or something like that.
I mean, there's people who know that eventually it will come back up. We'll keep on raising until it goes through. There's outside capital come in, so I know that there's like some major market makers that all coming in and buying this 96s, but it's not gonna go below. Their major money's at 95, 96. And hopefully we can get this thing up. I'm not worried. I know that's a worry. Some people have said, "Oh, it could go down to 85." We have some extra cash, just like emergency fund that happens, but I don't foresee that ever happening.
Makes sense. And we are about to undergo a 4% increase. I guess my question had more to do with whether there's a feeling, Cyrus, some of the other folks on this call. Of whether maybe that's too conservative at this point.
So I may have misunderstood your question, but it sounded like you were saying that the reduction in DAI supply was somehow in relation to the market maker inventories was not a good thing, but I think that's a very positive sign.
No. What I was saying is I was just looking at the scatter plot that you showed earlier, and we saw we were drifting down. DAI price was drifting down, but market maker inventories were staying flat. And what I asked him, what Joe was saying was, okay, that means they're saturated. They have enough DAI. They don't want to buy anymore because they feel that their exposure is at a level where they're potentially not comfortable accumulating more. So that was answered. But yes, I agree with you.
Okay, cool. Rich, what's
Well, Vishesh posted a link to his repo again with some interesting graphs in there. Vishesh, I don't know if you have access to a microphone. Did you want to walk us through some of those things?
So I basically just did an update of what I shared last week. So the one thing we did notice is the the trade volume on Oasis and 0x. It did sort of hit another new low and has kind of continually been dipping, kind of coincided to this small run up in price and then starting to run right back down to where it is now at about 96.
Do you want to do a screen share?
Sure. Yeah, sorry. So I was just talking about this graph here. So essentially what we saw was about 3-4 days ago, this dip in, sorry, that was about March 14th, dip in trading volume that immediately followed this tiny run up.
Could you clarify which line is which?
Yes, sorry. So the blue is the volume and orange is price. So what we saw was essentially around March 8th, when we last kind of talked about, oh, DAI price is improving, it started to run up to almost 99, and then there was a big dip in trading volume, and the price sort of continued to fall, and then volume started to fluctuate again. So I'm not sure what exactly happened, but it seems to me that there was something happening during that run-up, and then people essentially started to sit with their inventory again, and the price continued to fall. The other thing that was sort of minorly notable was on Compound, the borrow volume dipped a little bit, which that's the red line here. That doesn't happen very often, so it's kind of stayed steady and slightly improved. I can graph this on a different axis next time, so it's easier to see. But you see that supply volume had been coming down, but now borrow volume has also taken a small downturn. So these are not great indicators, and honestly a little bit confusing given that we increased the stability fee, which should theoretically have reduced the oversupply and improved both of these metrics, but we've actually kind of seen a little bit of the opposite of what we expected. So I'm not sure if that's a case necessarily for just a stronger increase. I mean, it doesn't seem that that there's any reason not to, but it is a little bit atypical from what we expected, I think. Stop presenting that.
All right, well, that's fascinating information, and I think that it raises a few questions because looking at these graphs, it's always the natural inclination is to try to create a narrative to explain things that we don't understand, which is risky. But I'm sort of tempted to do it anyways. I wonder if it might be an interesting thought experiment to try and figure out what some of these confounding variables might be here. So we obviously, there's the ETH price is obviously a big deal. We've seen a fairly flat market in the last couple of weeks, which is potentially removing that from the contenders. There's also been a lot of discussion about just simply the other rates in the market. So competition is a big issue for us, I think. And looking at, somebody presented recently the DIPOR, I think that's what they called it, the decentralized, actually, DIBOR. Sorry, Cyrus, did you see that?
Yeah, I remember, but I can't remember where I saw that.
Yeah, so trying to figure out what the average or interest rates that are being offered by lenders in this space and trying to figure out exactly how stability fees would match up with that is an interesting metric to look at as well. But
one thing could be, even if the Ether price is flat, if there are, getting that sense for like how many CDPs are changing, trying to get a sense for like what the demand for leveraging Ether is from this community compared with the rest of the Ether usage community. So if there's a way to break that out in some way, looking at, for example, I don't know, Ether held by same wallets as those held by I'm not very like
Yeah.
technically inclined, but like trying to break that out in some way.
I think it's important for people to realize that the ETH, in terms of confounding variables, the ETH price plays, a somewhat outsized impact on the DAI price because, leverage is the primary use case for DAI right now, which is why market maker inventories are, extremely important. As the ecosystem grows, as, the use cases of DAI kind of broaden out to non-trading and non-leverage use cases, we should hopefully see, less of a correlation, less importance placed on inventory levels and so forth. But yeah, for now it's super important. But
I don't thinking more along the lines in terms of like, even if the price is flat, like even if it, there isn't a move, it still could have a potential effect if, for example, there's a large demand for leverage and the DAI community's impact on that is like only X% of the outstanding Ether versus the 1 minus X% of utilitarian use of Ether outweighing that in some way. Like if there's a small decline of 95% of Ether demand, but a large increase in the 5%, the total price could be flat.
Right. I'm not sure if I followed along exactly, but maybe someone else wants to respond to that.
Just one quick thing to add is, so if you look on Compound, for example, the point that Rich was making about the maker stability fee versus sort of these secondary market interest rates, that gap had been closing for a while, and we finally sort of met the Compound borrow interest rate, the lending interest rate. And so essentially that has kind of stayed at about the level of the stability fee, where generally over time, like when the stability fee has moved, the interest rates have moved as well. So that's sort of interesting to note that it's actually kind of held around 3.45, 3.5, even though the stability fee is right there as well. So that gap has closed, but the WETH borrow rate, the interest rate on Compound is actually fairly low. So it's pretty cheap, and I think there's relatively low demand for borrowing ETH. I think we could speculate on like what the demand is for ETH, but really the interesting thing is as price volatility of ETH drops, I do think that hurts to some extent the demand for DAI because people are less worried about getting their CDPs liquidated, and so they're less likely to pay back debt. So that's also going to be a natural function of this kind of ETH price stability that's continued.
That raises some interesting points too, because this has been sort of a constant source of amazement for me with the crypto space in general, is that it flips the script based on compared to traditional finance, where traditional finance, you're more likely to know who is doing something as opposed to what they're doing. In the blockchain space, you know what people are doing. You don't know who or why they're doing it necessarily. And I think that this is, it's a tricky situation for us to be in because we're trying to anticipate people's requirements and trying to create sort of these game theoretical levers without entirely knowing why people are in this system in the first place. And I think that this is one of the challenges that we have. And so I'm getting feedback from somebody. Cyrus, is it you? So we're trying to figure out what people are up to and why, and then trying to figure out how a stability fee would affect those people can be very tricky. And I think that this is a discussion that we've been seeing in the subreddit as well, is that what does it actually take to move the needle here? And you have to play some thought game or create some thought experiments to try and anticipate what that means. Because if I'm a large CDP holder and I'm long ETH, or I am seeking minting DAI in order to gain interest somewhere else, how does a stability fee actually affect me? And this is something that I've been thinking about for a while too. The mechanisms in which we collect these stability fees are fairly painless and occasionally hidden from immediate. They don't have an immediate impact on people because you pay these fees when you return DAI to your position, and if your position is already fairly healthy, there's little incentive to actually spend too much time worrying about the distant future as these fees begin to accumulate. So those are all things that we need to try and consider when we're debating responses, especially when it comes to CDP activity with these stability fee raises.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think what you're bringing up also is a really good point. I mean, we're used to thinking of this stuff in a two-dimensional world, and you have to start thinking of it as a multi-dimensional question of not only, 0 to 1, right, and what shade of gray is it, but then it turns into a circle, and then it's a three-dimensional circle, and that shape of that completely changes depending on what's the intent of each person, and that's something that's going to change over time as we shift from purely Ether as the collateral base to other types of collateral.
Yeah, I think that, Baron, you suggested something along these lines earlier, but it might be an interesting experiment to actually try and figure out exactly what people are doing here, because we can make assumptions, we can make guesses, we can do some trolling through Etherscan, but perhaps like a chain analysis of precisely what the path is from DAI being created to where it goes and what people are doing with these things would be what might answer some of these outstanding questions.
Yeah, if those data are available, that would be phenomenal. I'd worry about like sample size at this point and robustness of any type of analysis therein, but that's definitely, even if like the cone around the line item that we could draw would be large, it's still useful to just see if there's central tendency changes on that.
Yeah, precisely. If we could see a funnel, this is how DAI was created out of a CDP, and this is where it landed across like a broad spectrum of the market, it might begin to answer some of these questions. How do we influence these things?
And segregating the data between who has what size position and what's the rate sensitivity, where's the elasticity of demand or elasticity point where it breaks over, where somebody who has an excess, a large, as the rates are increased, at what point do folks that have a CDP that only make up a number, 50,000 DAI of debt outstanding, what's their sensitivity compared to somebody who has 3 million? I mean, I would venture to bet, without looking at the data, and that's dangerous, but I'd venture to bet the majority of the reason why the DAI price is what it is not because of the large folks, but rather because of a bunch of small folks that are all exiting into a US dollar off-ramp.
Yeah, that's actually, it's a great observation. Obviously, people that have huge positions are going to behave differently than people with small positions. And I think we've also seen another variation between the sophistication of CDP owners, where some people, they see a rate increase and then they convert that to a percentage point. And they go, oh my God, it's gone up 700%. I need to close my $50 CDP immediately because the world is ending. Versus a large CDP holder thinking that, actually running the math and going, okay, well, this actually doesn't really move the needle that much for me if I'm planning to only hold this thing for another 2 months or whatever. So there's a lot of different perspectives we can look at CDP ownership and the activities of those large CDP owners as far as wipes and draws go. There's more data to gather.
I do want to echo that I think it's great that we're having a discussion about kind of a broader picture of DAI and kind of the life cycle of DAI. Where does it start? Where does it end? I have been looking into a lot of data on this. I think we're not necessarily going to get to a great answer on this call, but I think for next week, I'll try to look into some of the questions that we've posed here about sort of differential behaviors on different sizes of CDPs, for example, and see if we can come up with some interesting insights for next week.
That'd be fantastically useful. Reach out to us if there's anything we can do to help out, or if you want to brainstorm on that a bit.
Will do.
All right. Well, I'm looking at the time here. We have 15 minutes left. We kind of jumped into the general Q&A aspect of the call a little early, which is great. That's what I was hoping to see. But I want to kind of open the floor a bit to just more general questions. I know that they're out there. We have a pile of interesting suggestions in the MakerDAO subreddit. We have even more in the MakerGov subreddit. There's been discussions about debt ceilings as a risk parameter that can be tweaked. We have discussions about what a hard and soft peg actually means. There's some interesting discussions about reference exchange rates and where do we actually find information that makes sense to us. And it's something that I've been personally wrestling with. And at some point, I'm hoping that somebody smarter than me will explain how we're going to be weighting some of these pairs. Coinbase is a good example of that. If you look there, we're kind of using this as an authoritative resource because we are reasonably sure that they don't engage in wash trading or various other shady activities. But at the same time, the volume there is fantastically low. And so using that as like a primary source of the strength of the peg makes me a bit nervous sometimes. So what I want to do there is kind of open the floor to more broad-ranging questions. And David, I know that there's been a fairly active conversation happening in the side window here. Is there any questions that we can address as a group?
I mean, early on, I know Aviv had the question of whether the 4% increase is too little, but that was way earlier in the call. I know Matteo Leibowitz had asked whether the risk team thought about the impact of CDP interest rate futures on the effect of the stability, but that's super early.
So,
yeah.
Dave, Aviv, you have access to a mic. Do you want to ask any other questions that you had outstanding?
How you doing, Rich? Yeah, can you guys hear me loud and clear?
Yep, you're good.
Excellent. So my question, just a little bit rephrased here, is typically the market reacts ahead of the news, right? So if you know something's going to go up in price or down in price, people are buying as quickly as possible. So we're all monitoring the price of DAI. We know that the price of DAI is below the peg. There's an open vote poll. So everything is pointing to us raising the interest even further. There's a 90% chance in 7 days from now it's going to be at 7.5%, and yet we don't see people taking advantage of the discount today. So my question is, there's a philosophy that maybe that the interest rate will affect DAI holders when it kicks in. But what about the philosophy that it should already have a pretty sizable effect? If you knew the interest rate was going to be 20%. 7 days from now, and there's a discount today to pay it back, why wouldn't you pay it back today unless you're comfortable with the interest rate that you're going to see in the future?
Well, there's a difference.
Go ahead, Bear.
Sorry, there's a difference in looking at the stability fee and looking at the savings rate, looking at the interest rate that is provided. You make different decisions. Like if you had to take a loan from a bank and the bank said, you could take this loan out for 5 years, but and do whatever you want. The rate is X, and then at the end of 5 years, you have to pay. When you pay it back, when you return this, you also have to give me another 3.5%. That is treated very differently than the coupon payments you would have to make during the loan. So, like those two things interact differently with market behavior, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that to frame this discussion a bit more, Aviv, and it's something that we've been thinking about a lot too, is this concept of forward guidance. And you look at how traditional markets work. And I think that the delta here is that in the real world, people are a lot more sophisticated than they are in the crypto space. And we've seen that even though we all live and breathe in this world where risk parameters are being determined by governance, and this is our daily lives, there's a significant number of people out there who have no idea that anything has changed, let alone the fact that something is going to change in the CDP ecosystem. And so figuring out effective ways to set this idea of forward guidance and allow people an understanding that a change is coming is a tricky problem to solve, and I would love to hear some suggestions in this call about how we can solve that problem. And then having achieved that goal, the expectation that people will react in a rational and predictable manner to that information, I think, is an open question.
Okay, so I'll concede your argument that people are not completely tuned in, and maybe some people don't know the interest rate's going up, or they heard that it was 0.5% and they got excited about it and they never sort of clued in to the fact that it was going up or down. So wouldn't that argument suggest that maybe the interest rate isn't what needs to be affected, but letting people know, like vigorously, like emailing and putting up banners, maybe that's the real interest rate that needs to be changed, and not just the percentage.
Just to speak to that for a second, I know that in Maker, the UX team was focused. Well, there was some discussion about actually adding a banner to highlight stability fee changes even before they actually happen. So, the UX side of it and actually doing the informing is important.
And there's something to be said about the relative decentralization of how this information is dispersed. you know, kind of like governance issues with any other crypto system. You know, if you could easily and efficiently reach everybody in the system, it's, you know, tends to not carry some of the decentralization aspects that we're looking for.
Yeah, that's the major risk here. Is like we're talking about a polling versus a push method of communication, and if right now we have a polling method where people that are engaged in the system are expected to you know, maintain their positions and understand exactly how their money is being controlled or contained, but and that requires people to be deeply engaged, and I think that's probably not a fair thing to ask, because I'm not deeply engaged with every single crypto space organization that I'm interested in. So we need to figure out or come up with some solutions, and whether that's, you know, like, hey, everybody, you know, sign up with your username and password at here, and then we'll get you onto an email list, or whether it's we have banners across all of the MakerDAO properties that say like a vote is in progress, this part of the system has been altered. Even then it has a limited area of effect. So if people are aware of solutions that we could begin to look at for communicating things on a broad scale, we would love to hear about it.
So maybe I could just say the last final thing. Maybe a possible solution is the CDP portal could have like a big banner when big changes in the in the fee are set. Because right now the stability fee, it's as small of a number as almost any other number on the CDP portal. So maybe that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I think we agree, and that's something that we're already planning on doing. The banner idea is coming.
Another possibility would be to think about using on-chain data on wallets to look at if the, like, first the distribution of Maker and DAI held in terms of like where these changes are coming from, and looking at how, sorry, there's a bunch of ruffling going on. I don't know where it's from. Sorry. Oh yeah. So just looking at like the distribution of wallets in terms of like major DAI holders and major Maker holders, is that movement causing this, or is it coming from elsewhere? And looking at that participation over time and seeing if there's just big stores of, you know, Maker that isn't really voted or isn't really staked at all.
I see what you mean. So after we gather this information about exactly how DAI is being used or how these CDPs are being used, we can more effectively target those demographics specifically with information.
Yeah, basically.
So speaking of on-chain data, I think something that would be really interesting to look at is what's going on with Dharma, because they're offering DAI at 0.1%. So it's possible that people that have CDPs open are borrowing from Dharma and then paying back their CDPs, allowing them to maintain their ETH exposure, effectively arbitraging the interest rates. Yeah, I think they basically have ran out of DAI to lend. So I don't think the total size they've done is too big, but that would be a way for paying back CDPs without buying DAI on market, which might explain what we've seen. I'm not sure, but I guess you could look on chain to see if that's happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that we haven't really seen the area of effect for the lever tool yet. I think that it might be too soon to guess, because the rate, they're subsidizing that rate, and it's obviously not going to be sustainable in the long term. So I'm hoping that after they get out of alpha, we'll be able to get some numbers that actually have a direct correlation on what DAI supply looks like.
So can I actually bring something up that's been that I see in the chat? There is the question of what happens if the ETH price appreciates significantly, if that would cause a need for an extremely high stability fee increase. And so if anybody has thoughts on that, I would love to hear that. But.
Yeah, the answer comes down to what they do with the money. And we don't know that answer yet. I mean, when we implement a DAI savings rate, that'll directly that will immediately help smooth things out. But until we can figure out what people use their loan proceeds for, what percentage they're used for, it's just a guessing game right now.
But can't we track the wallets in some way? And again, I am super not knowledgeable in the technicalities here, but is there a way to actually like answer that question?
We can estimate it, we can guess, but let's imagine right now Ethereum goes from I don't care, 130 to 1,000, and everybody on the call is real happy, right? Odds are a lot of folks will start taking out loans. Odds are a lot of folks may even take a loan and buy a car with it. But that moment you take it off chain and you have an exit off ramp, we start getting in the discussion about what we do with the price, because it has now directly impacted the equilibrium. It's no longer, it's not singular. It's a multidimensional game where it's not only supply and demand and supply balance of usage in the system. The moment people start exiting the system, you start having another variable in there. What would people use it for? It's going to take time for that to smooth out.
The answer is though, yeah, there are specialized data services that can, with pretty high confidence, track where DAI is going, what percentage is hitting exchanges, and trying to identify various wallets and such.
It would be really interesting to know as well, and I don't know if this is possible to calculate, but the cyclical leverage generation process of one wallet, you could then look at all the wallets and see which wallets are cycling it, like starting with 1,000 ether, buying, putting it up, getting DAI, using the DAI to buy more ether, putting the ether up, getting more DAI, et cetera, and seeing which ones are actually taking advantage of that, and like how big those wallets are that are actually generating what proportion of leverage. Like,
that's
I
a
can
great
imagine
idea. That's the lowest hanging fruit, right? And that's easiest
Yeah.
to identify. If we just find out is the primary use case here leverage on a significant number of CDPs.
just like testing our basic assumptions.
Well, quick question. Like from those type of chain analysis, does anybody have an idea of how long it takes, how much historical data you need before you can associate a certain address with being
Yes.
an exchange?
Yes. Oh no, in terms of an exchange, I can answer it in terms of statistical robustness. I can't answer the technical stuff.
Because
Matthew, I know that there's enough data to identify wallets, at least from various data providers I've spoken to. It seems to be possible.
Fair enough. Because what you want to avoid though is kind of like doing the supply and demand game for oil markets, where you're basically the equivalent of driving down the highway using your rear view mirror to determine which exit you should take. And that's literally how supply and demand, people are almost guessing because the data is so stale. Now, if there's a way to do that with DAI, all the better.
There's no shortage of immutability here is going to save us, right? So there's going to be no shortage of figuring out exactly what people are doing in the CDP ecosystem for sure.
No, we know what addresses are exchanged with other addresses. Now, identifying which of those is an exchange, which of those was a Coinbase off ramp, which of those was a use case, that's not exactly. I mean, I would love to say I'm wrong.
Do we actually need to know that though? We just need to know how much DAI is coming out of a CDP and how much ETH is going back into that CDP and how their liquidation ratio changes over time, right? It's not going to be hard to just simply look at our ecosystem to figure out who's a leverager and who isn't.
Fair enough.
It's as we take 2 or 3 steps away from our ecosystem, it gets significantly, exponentially more complicated. But just figuring out activities on ours is going to be easy.
And not only just who is and who isn't, but how much leverage those weighted average wallets are taking.
Yeah, that sounds like it's a really good deliverable for either the next call or the call after. It's a missing piece of the puzzle that we can't ignore anymore. So I lost track of time because that was really interesting. We have 3 minutes left. So what we're going to do now is we're going to continue the same format as we did for the last couple calls. We will take the video of this, the audio of this, a transcript will show up very soon, and we'll post a discussion in the Reddit thread, and we'll continue to debate some of these issues. Stephen, did you want to leave us with a thought?
Yeah, just a sort of simple thought. I mean, I've been listening very carefully, and this has actually been a truly productive meeting from all stakeholders. I mean, the one thing we need to consider is, just to sort of close this off, is that we are a part of a broader system that is actually bootstrapping along with us. And what is interesting is that we have to consider, is that we may be slightly ahead of most of the system, but also maybe slightly behind a few of them. And we've got to keep this very pragmatic, because to Lewis's point, and I think a point brought up by Lev in a previous meeting, you need to be pragmatic about the current dependencies that exist in this DeFi space. So basically, in short, we need to consider models, metrics, and the collection of these really cool ideas that we've heard here in relation to the actual environment, and try and find an intersection that really helps us move forward. And as we get data and as we get more insight, so I think these ideas are going to manifest into real metrics that are going to allow us to
Steven, you're cutting out, yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, I just want to say, guys, thank you very much. The folks, thank you very much for joining this meeting. I'll let Rich finish it off, but it really has been very productive.
Yeah, this has been excellent. That's precisely what I'm hoping for, and each one of these meetings gets better than the last, so I'm super happy about that. So let's take all these excellent questions, excellent observations. We'll take the chat questions that didn't get answered, and we'll put those into the Reddit thread, so keep an eye on MakerGov in the next couple hours, depending on my meeting schedule, maybe a few more hours after that, and then we'll continue the discussion there tomorrow. Look for the executive votes, and let's make sure that we all get our voices heard in the direction of the DAO. All right, thanks everybody for coming. This was great.
Thank you all. That was a great call. Very interesting stuff.